Welcome everyone to this webinar from the Dark Energy Survey collaboration, presenting the cosmology result from the first 3 years of data out of 6. My name is Martin Crocce from the Institute of Space Science in Barcelona, and I will be acting as a chair. As you can all imagine, we are very excited of reaching this milestone and being able to present to you the result of many years of work. Next slide. The analysis was only possible thanks to the continued support of our funding agencies from 6 different countries, which are presenting here. Next slide, please. And a continuous and a tremendous effort from a multidisciplinary team of well over 100 people. So this is an attempt to collect all the names of the ones directly involved in the paper that we will be presenting today. And in boldface, you see the early career scientists, which we highlight in this way because they have truly been one of the driving forces of the collaboration. And that is something we are particularly proud of. Next slide. So these are now the faces of several of the people involved, in case you meet them once. And as you can see, everyone is very excited indeed. So the analysis in itself has been extremely complex, from the conversion of almost 40,000 images of the sky into the detailed properties of more than 100 million galaxies, including galaxy shapes and photometric redshift, the development of massive simulations and new methodological improvements, all combined to give cosmological constraints. It will be accessible in full at the end of this webinar in the DES webpage, and it's split into 29 scientific publications that you see here, in addition to our main key paper. Next slide. The structure of the webinar is the following. For the next 40 minutes, we will have 8 speakers that you see here, presenting the backbone of the analysis, and in particular, those aspects that we think are pushing the boundaries of our field, and leading to the discussion of our cosmological constraints in the last 5 to 10 minutes. And then we will dedicate 15 minutes to answering questions. You can submit your question at any time during the webinar. You should have received a Google form to do that, and we are also copy-pasting the Google form in the chat window now. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, given the overall 1 hour time frame that we have allocated for the webinar. And I think that's all from me for now. I leave you with Judit Prat. She's the first speaker, and will be getting us started. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Martin. So the Dark Energy Survey is a photometric galaxy survey which obsesses with a 570 megapixel digital camera, which is mounted in the Blanco Fermi telescope in Chile. You can see it here on the right. On the top, there is an image of the camera, and on the bottom, an image of the telescope. The full survey lasted 6 years of observations, and today we're going to present results from the first 3 years, which cover the full footprint and reach a limiting depth of 50% that of the full survey. The white field covers 5,000 square degrees, and you can see the footprint here together with the stars from Gaia. We observe in 5 broadbands, GRI, Z, and Y, reaching a limiting magnitude of around 23. And today, we will be presenting results from the first 3 years, which cover positions and shapes of over 100 million galaxies, which is the first time this has been done. Next slide, please. As its name indicates, the Dark Energy Survey, one of its main goals is to understand better what is driving the accelerated expansion of the universe. And so within the current standard cosmological model, lambda CDM, the universe is flat with a dark energy component in the form of a cosmological constant plus a cold dark matter component. Lambda CDM assumes general relativity, and it became the standard model following observations from type 1a supernovae and the cosmic microwave background. This model has had many successes, including being reasonably compatible with observations until now, but it also has some weaknesses, as shown in the next slide. Lambda CDM adds two new components to the standard model of physics, dark matter and dark energy, which have never been observed in a laboratory. And also, if we interpret the cosmological constant as the vacuum energy, we will find that it is around 120 orders of magnitude lower than what we expect from particle physics. So therefore, we're interested in learning more about this model and either validating it with higher precision or refuting or being able to refute it. So in the next slide, please. So one of the tests that we can perform to stress test this model is the following. So we can ask whether the late time clustering is compatible with the lambda CDM prediction, assuming initial conditions from the CMB. So the way this would work in practice is the following. Next slide, please. We can go and measure the amplitude of primordial scalar density fluctuations, AS, from a CMB experiment, such as Planck, which observes the early universe. And then we can evolve that following the lambda CDM model until the late time clustering and compare it with direct observations from the late time universe from galaxy surveys, such as the dark energy survey. And in particular, we will perform this test comparing the sigma 8 parameter, which is the amplitude of mass fluctuations today and is the dispersion of the mass fluctuations in spheres of radius of 8 megaparsecs. Next slide, please. So besides testing the lambda CDM model, we are also interested in testing some extensions of it. And in particular, we know that the dark energy component might not be a cosmological constant. And so what we can do is open up the parameter space to measure W, which defines the equation of dark energy, of a state of dark energy, relating its pressure and its energy density. So as you can see here on the plot on the right, both these models, WCDM and lambda CDM, can look very similar observationally, given the current statistical precision on the measurements. But however, just adding this new parameter W has deep theoretical implications, such as having to introduce new light degrees of freedom with, for instance, a new scalar field. Next slide. So within the dark energy survey, we have several ways of testing these cosmological models, and some of them will be more sensitive to the history of expansion, and some of them will be more sensitive to the history of growth, but also a little bit to the history of expansion, including large-scale structure measurements, weak gravitational lensing, and galaxy cluster counts. Today, we will be focusing on presenting results from the large-scale structure and weak gravitational lensing probes. Next slide, please. And Alex Amon, next slide. Alex Amon will be telling us more about these two probes from Stanford University.
Thanks, Judit. So how do we make these measurements? Here we're depicting the large-scale structure of the universe. So first, we observe the distribution of the foreground massive objects to be spatially clustered. At the same time, their presence distorts the orange fabric of the universe so that as light from even further away background galaxies journeys across the universe, its light path gets bent due to these distortions. So as a result, second, we observe our images of background galaxies to be slightly distorted, and galaxies whose light travel past the same structures in the universe, like the two galaxies on the left, acquire coherent distortions and alignments. Now, these two observations are key to our cosmological analysis. And on the next slide, we can look at this in a different way. So here we consider the simulation volume. Light from the background yellow galaxies travels through the large-scale structure in the box to the image plane at the front. The observed shapes in the image plane appear lensed or shared, we call them. And statistical measurements of their correlations carry the imprints of the large-scale structure that the light passed through. Now, for the foreground red galaxies, these trace the web of the simulation box, or the underlying dark matter structure, the bones of the universe. A measure of the spatial distribution of these galaxies, or how clustered they are, also tells us about the large-scale structure in the universe. So therefore, on the next slide, we have two fields that contain cosmological information: the Shear field from the background and the galaxy density field in the foreground. And for any field with a mean 0 like these, the simplest way to quantify the fluctuations is the root mean square. So that's sigma 8's parameter that Judit introduced. The next simplest way is to measure the 2-point correlation functions. Now, to compute the weak lensing correlation function, we need from these yellow source galaxies their positions and a measure of their shapes. And we compute the measurement between pairs of shapes as a function of their angular separation. Now, on the other hand, we compute the clustering correlation functions from pairs of positions of galaxies, those foreground red galaxies. Now, to model these 2-point measurements, we need to understand how far away the galaxies in our sample are, or their redshifts. So we measure the redshift distribution of the galaxy samples. And this allows us to directly relate our signals to the underlying structure of the universe. And we're particularly sensitive to omega matter, the amount of matter, and sigma 8. Now, in reality, we don't just have a source sample and a lens sample. We do our analysis tomographically or dividing it into redshift bins, and that allows us to probe the evolution of structure with redshift and understand dark energy. On the next slide, you can see that the cosmological workhorse of the dark energy survey we call the 3x2 point. So we combine 3 2-point correlation functions. The shape-shape correlation of the sources we call cosmic Shear. The position of the lenses is galaxy clustering, and the cross correlation of the 2 galaxy-galaxy lensing ties the galaxies to the underlying dark matter distribution. And you can see in the plot on the right that the cosmic Shear and the 2x2 constraints, as we call them, are complementary. They have different degeneracies in parameter space. And note that we're most sensitive to a combination of these 2 cosmology parameters that we call S8, defined here. The joint analysis of these 3 measurements allows us to self-calibrate nuisance parameters that hinder each of these measurements on their own. And therefore, we're able to maximize on the cosmological information. Now, on the next slide, you can see that it's a particularly exciting time for our field. There are 3 photometric surveys performing these low redshift measurements independently. And as Judit described, when they're compared to the cosmic microwave background measurements from high redshift, it creates a very beautiful end-to-end test of lambda CDM over cosmic time. So this plot shows a compilation of existing results of the clustering amplitude, that S8 parameter, and the orange bar indicates the best fit model to the cosmic microwave background measured by Planck, so shown here with free neutrino mass. DES is shown in green, and we have the largest data set of the 3. The results from HSC survey in red using their very deep data, and the fantastic results from the Kilo Degree survey in blue, the survey with the best wavelength coverage. Now, there's something very curious here. None of these measurements disagree with each other to any real significance, but lensing is persistently low compared to what the universe dictates. And it's intriguing to think that this suggests that there could be some kind of crack in lambda CDM. But it could be that there are systematics in one or both types of measurements. So bearing these in mind, you can see why we are very excited to add our new DESIER 3 results to this plot using a far more statistically powerful data set than ever before. Now, the next slide is overwhelming on purpose. It is a complex roadmap to deliver robust catalogs and our precision cosmology results. To match our state-of-the-art statistical power, we have developed new methodology at almost every step to enable us to accurately harness this information from the images. So here's just a top-level overview of some of the main parts of the process for DESIER 3. And we're starting with images on the left to cosmology parameters on the right. And each bubble required a busy team. Now, this morning, we'll give you a flyby tour of the key areas outlined at the bottom before we get to our results. So to quickly guide you through this maze, starting at the bottom left, the blue region captures how we extract photometry from our wide and deep images and calibrate redshift distributions. In orange, we'll showcase how we meticulously measure the shapes of sources and calibrate them to account for effects like crowded images. We move to the pink area to describe how we select that foreground lens sample that we use for clustering. We'll hear about the cosmological simulations, which form the foundation for validating our analysis. And of course, we need a theoretical framework and analysis choices, which are represented in green. Finally, we will tell you what cosmology results we found. And so with that, I'll hand over to Carlos Sánchez from the University of Pennsylvania.
Thanks a lot, Alex. So in the next slide, so we saw from Alex that in order to get unbiased cosmological constraints, DS or imaging surveys in general need a very accurate characterization of the redshift distributions for both the galaxies in the foreground that act as lenses, and also for galaxies that we have in the background and they act as sources for weak lensing. So this is a very important and challenging task, and it has required a lot of work from many people in this team. So I'm going to be talking about the redshift characterization of lensing sources, for which we use 3 independent sources of information. So on one hand, we use the photometry of galaxies or their colors in a method that we name SONPZ. We also use the positions of galaxies in a method that's usually known as clustering redshifts, or WZ for short. And we also use weak lensing information or galaxy shapes in the shear ratio method. So in the next slide, we sketch how the SOMPZ method works. And this is a Bayesian redshift scheme in which we use the information from the DS deep fields or supernova fields as an intermediate step between the small redshift samples and then the wide field DS galaxies. So if you look at this graph at the bottom, we can see how redshift samples for which we have spectroscopic or many band redshift information are these very small red points in the sky. So in this work, we take advantage of the fact that we have DS deep fields that overlap with this. And what's special about the DS deep fields is that we not only have deeper photometry in there, but we also have a broader wavelength coverage. So we have more photometric bands for them. So what we do is to match this spectroscopic or many band redshifts to information from our DS deep fields. And in that way, we're able to characterize the color redshift relationship, the relationship between photometry and redshifts in that space. Now, in order to translate that to DS wide field galaxies, which are noisier, we use this Balrog software in which we take images from the DS deep fields and we artificially inject them into our wide field images. So in this way, we use this Balrog technique to characterize how these deep field galaxies would look like in the noisier wide field realizations. And we can see that these Balrog injections have been made as a sampling of the entire footprint. So in this way, we connect these small areas with very accurate redshift information all the way to our wide field galaxies. In the next slide, we show how using this method, we separate source galaxies into 4 different tomographic bins, 2 of them shown in the upper panel and 2 of them show in the bottom panel here. And what these violins are showing here are the realizations of those redshift distributions when we actually include uncertainties coming from different sources, one of them being the different redshift samples that we have, or shot noise and sample variance in the deep fields and the redshift samples. Then we also include photometric calibration uncertainties, the uncertainties on the Balrog transfer function that I just explained, and any assumptions in the method. So for the first time, we're not only including uncertainties in the mean redshift of those distributions, but we are producing realizations of those redshift distributions, whose uncertainties you can see described in this violin plot, which shows the distribution of those redshift distribution values at each redshift. And in this way, for the first time, we've also introduced a way of fully marginalizing over the uncertainties that we have in the shape of redshift distributions and not only in their mean redshifts. In the next slide, we show how we include information from clustering redshifts. So this is a technique that allows us to get the redshift distribution of a sample for which we have a known redshift by measuring the cross correlation signal with a reference sample that has well-characterized redshifts. So in DSER3, we take an approach in which we produce a likelihood for this observed clustering redshift data as a function of the redshift distribution. And we do this by computing a prediction of this cross-correlation signal for each of these SOMPZ realizations that we showed in the previous slide. And this plot here, or this animation, shows how what's the effect of this clustering redshift likelihood on our sample of redshift distributions. And we can see that the clustering redshifts act as a smoothing on the shape of our SOMPZ realizations. So we can see how after adding clustering redshift information, the uncertainties in the shape of those redshift distributions get much smaller. And then finally, we still use yet another source of information in the next slide, what is this so-called lensing shear ratios method. In this case, we use ratios between galaxy shear 2-point measurements or galaxy-galaxy lensing measurements, as Alex introduced them before, using the same lens sample. And those ratios can help us constrain not only redshift distributions, but also other nuisance parameters in our model. In particular, they are pretty sensitive to intrinsic alignments on galaxies. So these ratios have a weak dependence on the galaxy matter power spectrum. So we can use them on scales that are smaller than the scales that we use for the 3 times 2-point analysis that Alex explained before. So what we're showing in this plot is we're showing here the distribution of the mean redshift of those four tomographic bins that we showed in the previous slide. So the yellow contours here are the mean redshift uncertainties coming from just SO and PZ and clustering redshifts. And the blue contours here include the information coming from this shear ratio technique. So we can see that they are not only in agreement, which adds a great validation layer to our redshift scheme, but we can also see that the red combination of these things provides a tighter constraint on the mean redshift of those parameters. So shear ratio helps constrain the mean redshift of the source redshift distributions. And like I said before, it also helps constrain intrinsic alignments. And in year 3, it's not only used as a redshift method, but it's used as an additional likelihood that is used in all the year 3 results. So with this, we have explained the redshift calibration for the 4 tomographic bins that we use for our source galaxies. And now next, Ami Choi from Ohio State University will tell us about how we measure galaxy shapes for cosmic lensing.
Thanks, Carlos. I'll give an overview of our catalog of galaxy shapes, which along with the redshift distributions Carlos just described, is one of the main ingredients of any cosmic lensing analysis. So here we can see what's happening to the light from distant galaxies traveling to us. Starting from the left and bottom row, the light's path is deflected by intervening mass structures. On its way to our ground-based telescope and detector, the light passes through the atmosphere where it gets blurred. And then it goes into our instrument and is bounced through the optical system, hits the detector, and is affected by things such as electric fields and electronics. And at the end, we get a pixelized image of the galaxy that is an aggregate of all of these effects. However, looking at the top row, we do have stars that we can use to separate the lensing effect from the atmosphere and instrument effects. So stars start out as point-like sources, and they're not being lensed. So they go through the same atmosphere and instrument effects. And we can model what we are calling the point spread function, or PSF. And for DES, we're using a software called PIF, which is PSFs in the full field of view. Next slide, please. So with a PSF model in hand, then we can use a method called meta-calibration to measure our galaxy shapes. The main idea behind metacal is to measure the response on an ellipticity estimator to an artificially applied shear. And so we can see in the schematic on the left that we start in the top left and estimate the ellipticity. And for DES, we're using elliptical Gaussians as our estimator. We then deconvolve the PSF and then apply shear, reconvolve the PSF, and then we can compare the output ellipticity estimate to the original ellipticity to understand the response. This method has been shown in previous works to be unbiased in the limit of weak shear, isolated galaxy images, and perfect knowledge of the PSF. Of course, in reality, we have things like crowding of projected galaxy images in our data, and we can use simulations to calibrate the bias from some of the real effects. Next slide, please. So here is an example side by side of a real galaxy image, image of galaxies from our DES data set, and then also an example from our image simulations. And so it's up to you to guess which one is real and which one is simulated. And we simulate the galaxy images in multiple photometric bands and apply the same measurement pipeline to understand the biases. So I'll give you 1 second, and then we can move to the next slide. And so the one on the left is simulated, the one on the right is real, and you might have been able to see that some of the features of the saturated stars are not quite simulated. Next slide, please. So the standard equation where we map the observed shape to the lensing shear is given by this equation on the top. And typically we're trying to understand two things, some sort of multiplicative error term, and then also an additive error term. For DSY3, we're seeing like few percent multiplicative biases due to blending. And then the new thing that we're doing in our work is to characterize the joint impact of blending on both shear and photo-Z. And so these, the traditional M is packaged together with the redshift distribution in this term that you can see in the bottom equation, which we're calling the effective redshift distribution. Next slide, please. So all in all, for Y3, we have over 100 million galaxy shapes measured. And you can see in the comparison of mass maps made from the different iterations of the DES data that we went from the science verification data set with a few million shapes measured to Y1 with 35 million. And finally, we have over 100 million galaxy shapes over the entire footprint. And the key improvements compared to DSY1 include more accurate PSF modeling, improved astrometry, an expanded suite of null tests and robustness checks, and then finally, the calibration using realistic image simulations that characterizes the impact of blending on both the shear and the redshifts. And there's also a few technical numbers for those interested in terms of the effective number density and shape noise. Next slide. So with the most statistically powerful catalog of galaxy shapes to date, we can make a measurement of cosmic shear, which has now gone from a signal to noise of 27 for Y1 to 40 for Y3. So you may recall from Alex's talk earlier that what we're measuring or estimating is the correlation between pairs of galaxy shapes. And we can do that as a function of angular separation on the sky, so that's the x-axis, and then also between different tomographic redshift bins, and that's each of these different panels. And we also have the psi plus estimator on the left and psi minus estimator on the right. And then what's overplotted as the green line is our best fit model. And the shaded regions, so that the best fit model takes into account all the different physics and systematics only for the non-shaded regions. And later on, Elisabeth will tell you more about the model and how we decide which data points we can accurately model. And for now, I think we can move to the next talk, where Jack Elvin-Poole from the Ohio State University will speak about galaxy clustering of our lens samples.
Thanks, Ami. Yes, so I'm going to talk to you about our foreground lens samples that we use in the year 3 analysis and the galaxy clustering signal that we measure in those samples. So in year 3, we're using 2 different lens samples that we analyze in parallel. The first is what we call the red magic sample. So this is the sample that we used in the year 1 analysis, and is a selection of luminous red galaxies that we think we have very good, very accurate photometric redshifts for the individual galaxies. And so we can split these up into 5 tomographic bins, which are shown on the top panel here. And we can stack the individual PDFs of the individual galaxies in order to get a redshift distribution. We can then validate that redshift distribution with clustering redshifts, so the cross correlation between our photometric sample and external spectroscopic data in the overlap region. So we're getting that mostly from BOSS and from eBOSS. In the year 3 analysis, we've also introduced a new sample, which is our fiducial sample for the main cosmology results, which we're calling the MagLim sample. So this is a sample with a redshift dependent magnitude limit. So only selecting the brightest galaxies in the sample, but without any color cuts. And here we use machine learning photometric redshift methods, called DNF, to split into 6 tomographic bins. And you can see that we can push up to slightly higher redshifts with the magnitude limited sample and at a higher number density, but at the expense of some photometric redshift accuracy. And similarly, we can use the clustering redshifts to validate these redshift distributions as well. So if you go on to the next slide, you can see the actual measurement that we're the actual clustering measurement that we're measuring with these lens samples. So what we're measuring here is the spatial position 2-point correlation function. And here we're focusing on the autocorrelations of each tomographic bin rather than the cross correlations between the 2 as part of our fiducial analysis. And so this is effectively measuring the number of pairs of galaxies at a given angular separation compared to a random field that traces our footprint. And the reason why we focus on these autocorrelations is because when we combine them with galaxy-galaxy lensing, we can calibrate out the galaxy bias, and from that combination get a cosmological constraints on the amplitude of the underlying dark matter. You can see from the figure on the right that there is a systematic correction that we have to apply to our data in order to get unbiased clustering results. So the red points are the uncorrected result, and the gray is what we use in our fits. And if you go to the next slide, I'll explain the systematic correction. Thanks. So we find, like most photometric surveys, that the galaxy number density will vary by a few percent with observational conditions, such as the air mass when the observation was taken, the exposure time of the images, or other photometric quantities. Or it could correlate with some astrophysical systematic, like stellar density or galactic dust. And these are both imprinting some structure into our maps that are not from cosmological origin. So we need to remove these from our samples. And so we do this simply just by regressing out these correlations, by reweighting our galaxy sample by the inverse of the observed correlation. So the figure on the right shows for a particular linear combination of the survey maps that we found to be significant, there is a correlation between galaxy density and this non-cosmological structure, and we can weight all our galaxies by the inverse of the red-fitted relation. If you go on to the next slide, you can see that we've also added a systematic uncertainty to our covariance matrix to account for uncertainties in the methodology for removing these systematics. So we have two basic template-based methods for removing systematics in the first place. These are both just different ways of doing the regression to remove the correlation. And then we analytically marginalize over two different systematic terms, one that accounts for the difference between these two methods so that we're insensitive to that choice, and one that tests for overcorrection or any biases on simulations. If you go to the next slide, you can see that we also added some additional validation to these methods that turned out to be quite important for the final analysis, where we tested on some simulated galaxy fields we tested how our method worked. So we tested for things like overfitting, or if our results were sensitive to any of our analysis choices. And we found that the biases were small, and what small biases we had, we can marginalize over in the final analysis. We also had Balrog image simulations that Carlos mentioned earlier. So these were ways for us to create simulated galaxy samples without any cosmological structure in there, so that we could directly test to see if there are any residual systematics, and we don't find any evidence for those residuals or for non-zero residuals from the Balrog data we had available. So if you go to the next slide, you should see the final galaxy clustering measurements that we have for these two lens samples. So our fiducial analysis is using this magnitude limited sample in the first 4 redshift bins that we defined. So these are the bins 1 to 4 on the top row. That's our fiducial analysis, and we exclude the high redshift bins due to difficulties in modeling. But we do present results in the final papers that include those high redshift bins to see the impact. And then we also present in parallel the red magic analysis using the red selected galaxies using all 5 redshift bins. On the final slide that I'll show is showing the galaxy-galaxy lensing signal. So of course, these are not just clustering signals. We also measure the lensing signal around each of these. So this is the tangential shear of the background galaxies around the stacked foreground lens samples. So here I'm showing this for the 6 magnitude limited sample bins. And you can see that with the year 3 analysis, we're getting a really high signal to noise from this galaxy-galaxy lensing measurement. So this is really, really exciting. The large scale structure systematics that I mentioned earlier, we found to be insensitive, the galaxy-galaxy lensing side of things to be insensitive to those large scale fluctuations, which is very encouraging and also tells us that we're doing something right in the way that we correct for these large scale systematics. So those are the measurements that we have for the lens samples. I'll now pass you over to Joe DeRose from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, who's going to tell us about the simulations effort.
Thanks, Jack. So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge the very broad simulation effort that we have in DES-Y3. We've designed sims to validate almost every aspect of our analysis, and I'm only going to have time to talk about a bit of that here. So I wanted to reference the other efforts on this slide so that people can take a look back at it if they want to. So I'll get started on the next slide. N-body simulations solve for the nonlinear evolution of the matter distribution under gravity. And using them, we can construct galaxy catalogs that look like the real data. And if we can do that realistically enough, we can use those galaxy catalogs to provide convincing tests of the robustness of our analysis to a variety of systematics. but doing so places very stringent constraints on our simulations. In particular, we need to have realistic correlations between galaxy observables in our simulations and large-scale structure. We need to run high enough resolution simulations to resolve all of the scales that we use in our analyses. And finally, we need to run enough volume of simulations in order to constrain systematics in our pipelines to high precision. So in the next slide, I'll tell you about how we've solved for those constraints with something called the Buzzard Flock version 2.0, upgraded over the version that we used in DES-Y1. In particular, we have 3 times the volume of simulations in Y3, and we've incorporated a number of methodological improvements. So I'll just briefly walk you through how we run these simulations, and I'll tell you about how we use them in the Y3 analysis. So we start with a cosmological model, which we use to run all of the simulations, which is represented by this initial power spectrum here in the top left. We then use that to run a high resolution n-body simulation, which we populate with a high resolution galaxy formation model, which can be empirically tuned to match a range of observed galaxy data. And you can see that after tuning, it does that quite well in this figure here on the bottom where the lines do pass through all that data. The issue with this high resolution model is that it requires simulations that are too expensive to run in the large volumes that we need to do the tests that we want to do in DES-Y3. So in order to circumvent that issue, we train a machine learning algorithm called ADGALS on that high resolution model and use it to populate lower resolution light cone simulations that we can run many of, in this case, 18. And we ray trace those simulations to provide weak lensing information for all of our simulated galaxies. And then we apply observational effects and select the lens and source galaxy samples that my colleagues have been telling you about, and use those to measure the 3x2 data vector that we want to test in our analysis. So in the next slide, I'll tell you about how we use those simulated samples and measurements, starting with the weak lensing source galaxy sample that we select from our simulations. In this case, the thing that we want to test with our source galaxy sample is the robustness of our redshift calibration methodology. And in order to do that, we need realistic photometric redshift uncertainties in our simulations. And we've achieved that in DES-Y3, as you can see in this figure here, where we compare the redshift distributions estimated for our source galaxy samples in our simulations in the colored lines to those measured in the actual DES data in dashed lines. And we've really measured these in exactly the same way in the sims and the data. And so this level of agreement allows us to do a variety of tests of our photometric redshift calibration methodology, including important tests of the clustering redshift and shear ratio pieces of this calibration. So in the next slide, I'll tell you about how we use the lens galaxy samples that we've selected from our simulations, where in this case, the thing that we really want to test is the robustness of our galaxy bias modeling methodology. And in order to do that convincingly, we really need simulated samples that match the clustering and galaxy lensing properties that we observe in a real data. So in this case, we're selecting a red magic galaxy sample from our simulations and comparing the lensing and clustering measurements in the data, which are represented by the points here, to the measurements, those same measurements in the simulations. On the left is the galaxy lensing signal, and on the right is the clustering signal for the 2 highest signal to noise bin pairs. And you can see the simulations match with the data quite well, and that allows us to do very convincing tests of our bias methodology. So on the next slide, I'll tell you about the end-to-end tests that we do using these simulations, starting from redshift calibration and 2-point correlation function estimation, and going all the way to cosmological parameter posteriors. And in doing so, we've shown that the pipeline that we use in the real data is unbiased in this complex simulated setting at the 0.3 sigma level. So the blue contours here are the results of running the exact same pipeline that we do on the data on the mean measurements from our simulations. And the black posterior here is what you would expect from a completely unbiased analysis. And you can see by the agreement between these two things, these two posteriors shows that our analysis is indeed unbiased in this simulated setting. And so with that, I'll leave it to Elisabeth Krause to tell you from the University of Arizona to tell you about correlation functions to constraints.
Thank you, Joe. All right, I'm the last talk before parameter constraints. So let me tell you how we turn the 3x2 point measurement into cosmology posteriors. We do that using Bayesian inference, for which we need a few more ingredients. beyond our data vector. That is, we need data likelihood and data covariance. And the DES covariance team has shown that Gaussian data likelihood and Halo model covariance are sufficient for our analysis. Then we need a model and associated parameters and their priors. We need criteria which measurements to combine. And we also want a blinding scheme to minimize observer bias. And I will tell you about these last three ingredients now. Next slide. As Judit explained, we want to constrain lambda CDM and WCDM cosmology, which means that our first 7 model parameters are already set. In order to then describe the 3x2 point data vector, we need additional astrophysics and systematics. For example, for galaxy clustering, we also need nonlinear modeling of the power spectrum, including galaxy bias and the impact of baryons. These nonlinear effects are only approximately known, and we want to make sure that our model choice does not bias the cosmology constraints significantly. And for that, we set a threshold of saying we want this nonlinear model uncertainty to bias us by less than 0.3 sigma. We first test that using simulated analyses, shown in the plot on the right, where the red contour indicates the results we would get with perfectly known nonlinear model. And the blue contour also includes a theoretical conservative envelope for our modeling uncertainty. And then we adjusted which data points to include until the offset between these two contours is less than 0.3 sigma. And then in the next step, of course, we validate that analysis end to end on simulations, as Joe just told you. Next slide. That then brings us to the full 3x2 point model. On the astrophysics side, we have galaxy bias, magnification, for which we fix the parameter in the inference, intrinsic alignment, using the tidal alignment, tidal talking model with 5 parameters. And then we also have 16 calibration parameters for photometric redshift and shear calibration that you heard about in earlier talks. The plot on the right here shows one example fit to a shear correlation function. Again, the region shaded in gray is the part of the data vector that we do not include in the fit due to nonlinear modeling uncertainties. The top line shows the complete signal, and the green, blue, and yellow lines show different splits of the intrinsic alignment contributions. While we allocated 5 parameters for intrinsic alignments in the model, our data actually shows that intrinsic alignments on these scales appear to be quite simple. Next slide. Then we need criteria for data when we are allowed to combine data. Within the 3x2 point data, we use the posterior predictive distribution to quantify internal consistency directly in data space, as shown in the plot on the bottom, where you can see the data and then PPD realizations drawn from our full chains. And we agreed beforehand to accept the model fit if the p-value is larger than 0.01. This then led us to discard the 2 highest lens redshift bins for the cosmology analysis, because we found that the internal consistency of our data vector was insufficient. Moving on to cosmology constraints, including external data sets, which will of course lead to the tightest constraints. We now have additional parameters that we cannot predict from DES data, which means that we need to use different tension metrics than PPD. And there we use both parameter differences and evidence-based methods, again agreeing on the same p larger than 0.01 threshold to combine. Next slide. At this point, we've talked about the content of 27 research papers, which means that there's many algorithms and model choices that these results are based on. And we want to make sure that these choices are not tweaked based on confirmation bias, which means that we implemented a 3-stage blinding process, shifting the catalogs, the correlation functions, and the contour plots. And we took them out step by step as different parts of the analysis were frozen. So for example, the data vectors and modeling were frozen before we unblinded the parameter constraints. And we also finalized the list of model tests in combinations with external data before unblinding. Next slide. So with that, I present here the 3x2-point data vector and best model fit for cosmic shear on the left, galaxy-galaxy lensing on the top right, and galaxy clustering on the bottom right. Again, the line here is the best model fit to the full 3x2-point data vector in the white regions. The gray shaded regions are those that we discard due to nonlinear modeling uncertainties. And you will also notice that there's now 4 lens galaxy bins shown because we do not include bins 5 and 6. And with that, I hand over to Michael Troxel from Duke University for the cosmological interpretation.
Thank you, Elisabeth. So on the next slide, you've seen this flowchart near the beginning of the talk, and we have now made it all the way to the end. And so hopefully you have a small picture, at least, of the process that is required to go from pixel level data to the final cosmological contours that I'll show you on the next slide. I won't keep you in suspense any longer. First, I'll talk about the 2 semi-independent probes, cosmic shear in blue, and the combination of galaxy clustering and tangential shear data in orange. These are both able to provide cosmological constraints in our cosmological model, in particular the clustering amplitude S8 and the density of matter omega m, where cosmic shear is more sensitive to the clustering amplitude, while the other 2 probes are more sensitive to the total matter density. You can see the constraint on the right here, and in particular that the 2 subsets of the full 3x2-point data vector provide consistent cosmological contours in these parameter spaces. We find that the data is consistent within itself, and so on the next slide, we can finally combine this into the final fiducial 3x2-point result, which is shown in black, which is the combination of the information in the blue and orange contours. This represents about a factor of 2 improvement in statistical power over the year 1 results. And I've shown some of the key cosmological parameters on the left. As you look at the contour in particular, we have found that we find no preference for the need for a free dark energy equation of state in the WCDM model over lambda CDM. And so the rest of the slides will focus on lambda CDM. We go on to the next slide. In addition to the fiducial sample, you've heard that we have produced 2 lens galaxy samples to do cosmology with. The second, the red magic lens sample result, is shown here as the dashed contour compared to the fiducial result. And you see in the full data vector, we have almost perfect agreement in the lambda CDM model between these 2 lens samples. In the next slide, I show the separate cosmic shear and galaxy clustering and tangential shear results for the red magic sample. And the first thing you'll immediately notice is that the 2x2-point result prefers a lower clustering amplitude, which corresponds to a higher galaxy bias. Formally, the blue and orange contour are statistically consistent within the model, and so we can combine them into the 3x2-point result. Doing that pulls the S8 value up due to the information in cosmic shear and brings galaxy bias back down to agree more with the year 1 data. As you can guess, seeing these results led us to explore the potential for systematics in the lens clustering data. And we have identified what could be potential systematics at an observable level in the red magic clustering data at all redshifts and scales. And as you've heard before, above the fiducial redshift range of the Maglem sample in the highest 2 redshift bins. If you go into the next slide, we've modeled this effect using a parameter that we call X-lens. This parameter essentially completely decorrelates the lensing and clustering amplitudes to allow them to be fit separately, as you can see in the equations on the left. Freeing this parameter in the 3x2-point analysis leads to a fit of around 0.88, which is highly inconsistent for red magic from the value that it should be, which is 1 in the lambda CDM model. The dotted contour on the right shows the impact of freeing that systematics parameter. And as you can see, it has very little effect on the final cosmological results from 3x2-point. However, in WCDM, this parameter does highly correlate with W, the dark energy equation of state, in the red magic sample. And so we don't trust the W results for red magic. One of the big questions moving forward, of course, is exactly what X lens represents physically or systematically, and we don't have a final answer for that question yet. If you go into the next slide, going back to the fiducial sample and one of the original questions we posed at the beginning of this webinar, one of the most powerful tests we can do of this lambda CDM model is comparing the direct measurements of the clustering amplitude with DES data at low redshift, shown again with the fiducial result in black here, to the prediction from measurements of the CMB at very high redshift, which is shown in green. If these are consistent, that's a very strong validation of the standard cosmological model. And in fact, we do find that they are statistically consistent with a probability to exceed of between 10 and 50%. Given this result on the next slide, we are able to combine these two very powerful data sets into one joint constraint on the next slide, which is shown in orange here, the combination of DES and CMB data. In addition to this combination of low and high redshift data from DES and Planck, on the next slide, I'll show you a third set of data that is independent from both of these and represents other non-lensing low redshift probes. These are shown in orange and include supernova 1A, baryonic acoustic oscillations, and redshift space distortions. These sets of data together probe both the growth and expansion history of the universe independently from DES and the CMB. And together, these three independent and highly complementary data sets give us this kind of triangle of contours you see on the right. These three sets are highly complementary and also consistent with each other at around the 1 sigma level. If you go to the next slide, we can combine the DES measurements of clustering at low redshift to the constraints from the other low redshift probes shown in orange, and we get this purple contour, which represents the full span of cosmological probes at low redshift, nearly the full span of cosmological probes at low redshift, in order to compare to the Planck prediction. We find agreement again at around the 1 sigma level, or probably to exceed 0.3. Next slide. Because all of these data sets are consistent statistically, we can combine them into a final joint result shown as the blue contour here in lambda CDM, with several of the key cosmological parameters shown on the left. I'll give you a few seconds to take those numbers in. And then on the next slide, I'll also show these contours, the same sets of contours, but in the WCDM model space. So these are shown here. As you can see, the low redshift data especially provides an incredibly strong constraint on the dark energy equation of state with a final constraint less than 3%. Okay, then I will leave you on the next slide with a set of summary comments as we prepare to take questions. And in particular, I want to point you to the web link at the top of the slide, pointing to the Dark Energy Survey website, where these cosmological results will appear in paper form around now at the end of the webinar. And with that, I'll thank you and pass it back to Martin.
Thank you, Troxel, and thank you all the speakers for a very comprehensive and very neat presentation. So let's move on to the questions now. Remember, you can ask questions using the Google form. And I will select some questions and select someone of the speakers or panelists that we have. So Alex, I will direct one question to you first. In slide 55, I did not understand why there are two gray shaded regions. Can you explain that?
Sure. So the gray regions just represent the measurements that we discard because we are unable to model the small scale physics to sufficient precision. we showed two regions for cosmic shear. One is the fiducial scale cuts and one of the optimized or the lambda CDM optimized scale cuts. And that's because our scale cuts are defined to satisfy the 3 × 2 point WCDM constraint. Whereas if we're just in lambda CDM, we can safely push to smaller scales and stay below our required threshold for bias on cosmology.
So Elisabeth, there is a question on intrinsic alignments. Learning from DSY3, which aspects of intrinsic alignments will be more critical to get right in our modeling, luminosity, redshift evolution, or nonlinear small scale behavior? Can you take on that?
Thank you. So of course, these are all related. Luminosity and redshift dependence often get put together into one aggregate parameter. And we need separate redshift evolution for each term, pushing in more detail to small scales. In the year 3 analysis, we found nonlinear linear alignments to be sufficient for our scale cuts. However, that of course gets a big question mark as we move forward to more constraining data sets and especially also more aggressive small scale analyses. So where the small scale modeling will become more important, and the redshift evolution will be especially important as we move forward to more complicated equation of state parameterizations, say W not WA.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Scott, maybe you can take on this question. It says you made a lot of analysis choices before unblinding that you couldn't change anymore after unblinding. What would you do differently if you started analysis today?
Yeah, a number of people, including Simon Samaroff, who is not here, looked at possible intrinsic alignment models. And based on the DSY1 results, we decided to implement a fairly complex intrinsic alignment model, TAT. In retrospect, if we had not used that, if we had stuck with just the nonlinear alignment model, we would have had tighter constraints. And the argument, and what we'd like to do in the next round, I think, is try to develop a metric beforehand that we can assess whether this complex model is required before opening the box. And if we would have done that in this case, we probably would have been able to stick with NLA and then get tighter constraints.
Thank you, Scott. Anna, we have a question for Mark Lim. What causes the two higher for source means to be inconsistent?
Yes, so similarly to the excellence factor of red magic, we don't have a final explanation for what's happening in the two higher redshift bins of MacLean, but at that redshift range, those two bins are the ones most impacted by lens magnification, and are also the redshift bins in which it's harder to calibrate the photometric redshifts. So we believe that that could be the cause of the inconsistency between model and data measurements.
Thank you, Anna. Troxel, we are asked here, was red magic your fiducial sample for clustering before unblinding?
Yes, so a priori, before unblinding the results, we had more trust in the red magic sample because it had more precise photometric redshift constraints due to being a selection of red sequence galaxies. We, in fact, unblinded the red magic sample several months before we were able to unblind the magnitude limited sample. And during that time, we were faced with this, this problem of trying to understand what this X lens effect we discovered was. And while as you saw, the 3x2 point results are robust to including this or not, we made the decision before unblinding the magnitude limited sample that if there was not this coherent all redshift scale offset or decorrelation in the magnitude limited sample, then we would use that sample as the fiducial cosmology before we saw the magnitude limited results.
Thank you, Troxel. Eli, if you are on, Someone asked why the DES footprint had that weird shape.
Oh, this was years ago. It is the main rectangle is overlapping SPT. And then we also wanted stripe 82 as much coverage as possible. So that gives the flagpole. And then given our timing and to minimize the amount of edges, we put a big circle on top of that. That became our round 82 footprint. And then in the corner, the SPT region, it turns out, overlaps quite a bit of the Large Magellanic Cloud, which originally we said, oh, it's several degrees away, but the LMC is actually very, very large on the sky. That's why it's called the LMC. And so we have to block off that rectangle in the corner, or else you're just, buried in LMC outliers or outskirts stars. So stripe 82 plus SPT plus a big circle.
Thank you very much. Carlos, there is one on shear ratio. I will try to.
I think it was about the independence between shear ratio and the other 2-point functions.
Right.
Yeah, I can answer that one. So there's mainly two reasons why shear ratio is independent from the other likelihoods. First, we of course use scales that are not used for galaxy-galaxy lensing in 3x2. And then the small scales in galaxy-galaxy lensing are dominated by, the uncertainties are dominated by shape noise. And that makes that part of the covariance pre-diagonal. So the different scales don't talk to each other much. So that is one reason. But then another big reason is because for the galaxy-galaxy lensing modeling in DS year 3, we use this so-called point mass marginalization scheme, which basically marginalizes over uncertainties or contributions in galaxy-galaxy lensing from scales smaller than the ones we use, right? So the combination of these two effects is what makes us to be independent, makes shear ratio to be independent from the other 2-point functions. There's more concrete statements and tests about that in the shear ratio paper that I guess now it's public. So yeah, you can also read there.
Okay, thank you. One second. So maybe Alex, what will change methodologically and in terms of data for year 6?
Our year 6 data will grow in depth rather than in area. And like we saw in year 3, having the most statistically powerful data set is both a privilege and a challenge. So I think we've done a good job of developing our methods to be able to use the data effectively for Y3. And I think, although that will be challenging to harness the gain in depth for Y6, I'm confident we can do so again. Our data calibration methods will be tested to unprecedented depth. So measuring shapes and redshifts is increasingly more difficult with deeper data, but that's good preparation for science with Rubin Observatory in the future. And the same analysis choices that we made in Y3, though we want to be able to, as Elisabeth mentioned, use different intrinsic alignment models or use different scales, we still need to test that even the choices we made in Y3 will be sufficient for this enhanced precision. So we will be trying to innovate there to be able to push our theoretical framework more, but we still need to pass the same rigorous tests that we passed for year 3.
Thank you. So Troxel, I have a question here. When combining with Planck, do you just multiply the likelihood, or do you take into account the covariance?
Okay, right. So one of the things that we do when we compare to other data sets and combine the likelihoods is we reanalyze their data within the model space that we use. For example, the biggest impact on Planck is frame the neutrino, the sum of the neutrino masses. The data sets are statistically independent because DES is such a low redshift probe and a small part of the sky. And so within the sampling, we do just multiply the likelihoods together, essentially the posteriors together.
Thank you. So we'll do the last question. I think Joe, maybe you can get this one. It says your model fits the data point quite well in the shaded regions that we are excluding in the fits. This suggests that the model does better than you expected. So what are the prospects for including these small scale regions?
Right, so as we go to smaller scales, there are many more potential degrees of freedom that we need to account for. And so in Y3, we really chose to go a simple route and incorporate as few degrees of freedom as we thought were necessary. But we do have a number of efforts going on within DES to incorporate models that we think can robustly account for those degrees of freedom that are necessary when we go to those smaller scales. For instance, halo models and hybrid simulation perturbation theory models that I think there are good prospects for using in DES Y6, and also models for accounting for baryonic effects in cosmic shear. So I think in the future, we will likely have alternative analyses that incorporate those, but I think it's also likely that we'll also produce analyses that are kind of minimal in the same respect that we have in DES Y3. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. So we will be stopping here. Vuv, maybe you can share your screen, the last slide again. So I wanted to thank everyone for attending on behalf of the DES collaboration. We now invite you to go into the DES webpage that we just showed and check out all the publications with the full year 3 analysis. And we are basically done. We are looking forward to see you again soon, this time for the release of the final cosmology result from the whole 6 year, the data from the dark energy survey. Thank you very much.